Side note on that, by the way, could we do a podcast on Christians being unsustainable and whether or not that's an affront to creation?
Yeah. So your point is we earn a lot, we spend a lot. The unsustainability of that generally, financially, environmentally.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, minimalism, right? Like,
Gosh, yeah.
I identify as a minimalist and I have no problem acknowledging it. I don't always do it well, but I love that philosophy. So yeah, this is not just financial, it's environmental as well.
All right. Okay. Put a pin in that. Let's
Yep.
talk the difference between wealth and greed
Well,
because I
right.
think that's an important distinction.
Yeah. And I don't even know if I have an answer for you. I want to verbally process that with you. Like, what is greed?
Well, I guess greed is a desire for more, and more, isn't it? Like greed is the outworking unhealthily of wealth,
Okay.
accumulation, to bring in as much as possible at the expense of whoever might be standing in your way, just to accumulate. Like there was a show called Gold Diggers that I don't think was particularly popular, but when you can't sleep and you're watching it at 2 a.m., it was about people just obsessed with wealth.
Yep.
And just the accumulation of wealth.
Yep.
Right. So I think your important distinction is it possible for you to be wealthy but not be greedy?
Yes.
And I think that's true. You could.
I want to say there must be. Like, it's a fine line, but there has to be.
So that's what we're trying to find out now.
Well,
isn't it?
but do you know what? I don't even think that's a good starting point because our problem is not how do we be wealthy without being greedy and where's that line? Because so many of us are greedy. Like, I think we work on an assumption that greed is real.
Yes.
And therefore, let's unpack that a little bit more than trying to work out, how do I be wealthy? The problem is not our wealth. The problem is our greed.
Okay, so what does that look like? Because that's we're not just associating to this with wealth.
Yeah.
A greed could be any...
Well, according to your definition, and I think I agree with it, there's a heart issue here.
Yes.
And there's a theological issue of the provision of God is
Yeah.
not sufficient, and therefore I must gain more. So there's a faith element here.
Yep.
There's a trust element. There's a give us today our daily bread.
Yes.
God, you have shortchanged me. I must get more. And when I get more, to the point of the Harvard University study, I will then try and get more after that.
Yep.
And there's a heart thing there, irrespective of the dollar amount ascribed, because purchasing power is real. Like $30,000 in one country will buy you as much as $150,000 in another.
Sure.
So it can't be about the number, but the heart of when is enough, and what is your view of God's provision in light of what you currently have?
So is this then a conversation about reliance? Because if you're greedy, then you are reliant on yourself
Yep.
to generate as much as possible
Yep.
to sustain you, and that figure may actually be
There's like
unsustainable.
there's an anxiety, and I don't mean that in a clinical sense. I mean it in a spiritual sense of there's an anxiety that goes behind greed that says I don't currently have enough. I must have more. And
Yep.
to your point, and to a different podcast episode, you just look at the outworking of that, of the impact on the planet and the impact of others in the planet, and go, that's probably past a point of equilibrium of being healthy.
Sure. Okay. How did we see? Because I think one of the things that you said to me, hey, we've got to do this one on greed off
Yep.
the back of a Keller quote.
Yeah. So Tim Keller quoted a few weeks ago. So it was March the 7th. And I just love that he did it because
Yep.
it's gutsy. He's not the first person I've heard say it, but I just appreciated that he went public with it. So he quoted on March the 7th, direct quote, Jesus warns people more often about greed than about sexual immorality, yet few thinks they are guilty of it being greed.
Yes.
So I think he's speaking into the context of Christian subculture that wants to talk a lot about sexual immorality and issues of sexual identity, fine, but also recognize that Jesus talks more about guilt and money. Why aren't we talking about it? I think is the implicit message of his tweet.
Right. I wonder, what does that give shape in a church look like? Like it was not unusual for me to go to the States when I was living over there to someone's house and find that they were parking on the street because they had so many possessions stored up in their triple car garage,
Sure.
which included things like jet skis or quad bikes, or so there was an accumulation
Yep.
of possessions.
Yep.
Is it there was a desire to always have the latest and greatest automobile,
Yep.
the latest and greatest computer, the latest and greatest car. I feel that these are examples of greed on
Yep.
some level, aren't they? Like, I need this, I want this.
Yep.
But what we've done is we don't actually understand what we need. Give us this day our daily bread. And so we've replaced needs with wants.
Yep.
Because, what is it? Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yep.
I think if we understand Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where we function 99% of the time,
Yep.
and for most of us 100% of the time,
Yep.
is in a realm of want, which means surely we are all guilty of greed
Yep.
in some place. And this is one of the reasons why it's one of the 7 deadly sins or 7 vices
Yep.
that we need to have an awareness of. Is it's so pervasive in a wealthy Western culture.
Which is exactly the reason why we need to talk about it, but also exactly the reason why we don't talk about it.
Yeah, because we're
it
guilty of
is
it.
so universal that it's like we basically put it in the too hard basket because it's everywhere. And it's also abstract. I think that's the other challenge with greed.
Okay.
You can't look at someone's pay packet. You can't look at someone's car necessarily, although that gives a bit more of an indication. But I think the fact that greed is, and I do genuinely think it is a matter of the heart.
Yep.
How do you diagnose that? How do you speak to someone else about it if you're seeing it without looking like a hypocrite? And how do you, in your context and my context, how do you preach about it without feeling like a hypocrite? I think because it is everywhere, it's almost hard to know where you start.
And I think we see expressions too within culture where there is a rebellion against this greed. So I think van culture, the fact that we're seeing all
Yep.
these Instagram influencers driving around the country in their
Yep.
van, the tiny home, the small house movement,
Yep.
Marie Kondo,
Yep.
who is, minimalizing houses. I have probably an unhealthy obsession with Scandinavian mini log cabins.
I'm with you, brother.
It's like,
I'll sauna with you in that cabin.
it's just bespoke, lined with wood, and there's a bed, there's a stove top.
But do you know what's funny? I've heard that critiqued though. The fact that that is your dream shows that you've had it all already.
Yes.
Right? The person in poverty isn't dreaming of a Scandinavian log
No.
cabin with bespoke inbuilt furniture. They're dreaming of having a bit more stuff because they've never had anything. So the critique of minimalism and Marie Kondo and all this and what you've just said is you've just proven your entitlement and your affluence by the fact that you're saying, oh, I've transcended past stuff. I'm so wealthy that I'm bigger than that now.
I'm not denying it. And we see that in, was it Ecclesiastes where he says meaningless,
Yeah.
meaningless, everything is meaningless, is that Solomon at some stage transcends all his wealth and says, what I actually need is God.
Yep.
And I feel like that's this is the season we find ourselves in. The church is starting to rediscover apophatic prayer because we want the quiet.
Yep.
And we want to get beyond this consumerism kind of voice to find a place where we can actually hear God again.
Yep.
And the outworking of that for me is I want a log cabin with no Wi-Fi.
Yep.
And what I'm screaming is...
My heart bleeds for you. You poor baby.
Poor baby. I'm demonstrating grief.
I'm sorry.
I'm demonstrating...
I'm exactly the same.
But how hard is it? I remember reading, what is it, Salt, Light and the City, which is a Graham, someone, I forget his last name. Sorry, Graham. Salt, Light and the City is the book. And he says, a Christian these days more likely looks like a single mum living in a favela in Brazil than it does a white guy
Yep.
living in the Western world.
Yep.
Is that single mum living in Brazil has not once, to your point, ever thought about a Scandinavian
Sure.
log house.
Yep.
And the reason that she hasn't done that is because she's functioning within want,
Yep.
not need, which means that prayer, give us today our daily bread, has far more resonance for her because she wants,
Yep.
Lord, to provide bread for her today, otherwise her kids go hungry.
Yep.
We have no concept of that. And so the truth of what Keller is saying
Yep.
is we are all guilty of that, and we shun the blame to something that seems a bit more sinful,
Being the sexual ethic.
whatever it is,
Yep.
the best sin for you to draw attention to is the one that you don't commit
Yeah.
to.
Yep.
And that is where he's saying we need to all pause and reimagine what
Yep.
this looks like as an expression within our culture. And I don't know what that looks like.
Well, let me give you an example from my life. Please hear me very clearly. I have not mastered this, but I'll be a bit vulnerable for a moment. And I've shared this story in the housing affordability episode, the entrepreneurship episode. But to cut a very long story short, I became an accidental property developer. Right? That's
Yep.
the very quick version. It wasn't my plan to do it on the scale that it transpired, but lo and behold, I'm a landlord of multiple properties. Let's just put it that way.
Yep.
That raised so many questions for me about just because I could do it doesn't mean I should do it.
Yep.
So that was my first question was, let's challenge this kind of up and to the right mentality. Sure, financially it's a great move, but there's more than one kind of currency in the kingdom, and one of those is our hearts and our integrity. And so I suppose the reason I'm sharing this story is to hopefully try and put some, where do we go from here, behind the problem. For me, one of the things that I worked out along the way was that personal accountability became very important. So functionally what that meant was I went to a couple of my close friends and I said, this is what I've got on the table.
Yeah.
This is the scale. This is the kind of money involved. This is what it could produce. A, do you think I should do it? And B, if I do it, can you please point out to me if you see me changing in the process? So my guardrail, if you like, and I looked a lot at Proverbs for this, you know, a wise man has many counselors.
Yeah.
I think that just exposing it as a start, you know, saying to a friend, a Christian friend, hey, I'm earning this much money.
Yeah.
These are my expenses. What do you think?
Yeah.
I think that's probably a healthy start at the very least.
Yeah. I was listening. I was listening to a podcast with Ben Affleck and Matt Damon.
Yeah.
And they were talking about their friendship. And one of the things that I think it was Matt made this point is that he's like, you have to, the more famous and the more successful you get, the more you find yourself surrounded by an echo chamber of yes. And that's really unhealthy because that's the thing that makes you weird.
Yep.
And so he made a very asserted effort to surround himself with people who had the ability to say no into their life, which is this idea of a wise counselor.
Yeah.
Is someone who isn't necessarily interested in the outcome, but is interested in you and your personal spiritual health.
Yep.
And the more successful you get, the more likely that you have someone to come alongside of you and, you know, suckle at the teat of your wealth so that they might become more wealthy.
Yep.
And so they're more likely just to say yes, because I want to stay close to you. But to surround yourself with people who are willing to say no, that's a stupid decision.
Yeah.
And it's not from a point of a financial decision. It's actually a spiritual health for you. That's the thing that you need. And that's the thing we're all desiring. But I think, I don't speak from the same place as you with property development because I suck at it. But if you've got a car that works, you don't need a Tesla.
Yep.
And that's not a sustainability issue because you've got to pour a whole bunch of resources in to build that Tesla. The car that you has already established a carbon footprint. It's fine. Run it into the ground, and then whatever your next one is for, pay for it in cash.
Yep.
Right? And because you have to think, I'm going to pay for it in cash,
Yep.
you're not going to buy a fancier car because you go, oh, I want to keep some of that money, right?
Yeah.
Whereas if you lease it
Yep.
or you purchase it with a repayment plan, you'll get a much more luxurious cash car because that one, you're just seeing the repayments on it. But if you think, I've got to pay that lump sum, you're probably going to buy a much more humble and reasonable car. And these are the questions that I think you should ask for everything, right?
Yeah. And as a Christian, what would that saving of the humble car allow for in the kingdom of God?
Where would you redistribute it?
Yeah.
The Christian church, it was a Barna survey, demonstrated that we're still a behemoth when it comes to giving, right?
Relative to the world.
Relative to the world. But if you're in church,
Yep.
Like I see the bank account and I know who gives what.
Yep.
It's still tiny
Sure.
comparatively. There's one of the reasons why, in the early church, every 7 family units you can establish a rabbi is because those 7 family units who
Yep.
are tithing will pay for the salary of a rabbi. But
So
we
a
don't-
church of what, 200 people should have like 30 pastors.
yeah, but we don't work on that. Today's model is for every 50 people,
Yep.
you should have a half-time employee,
Yep.
and for every 100 people, you should have a full-time employee. And it's a very different because we're working on a different narrative for giving, for generosity, for tithing. And I think part of that is influenced by greed.
Yep.
Because to sustain the style of life that we have right now, we need more wealth.
But in the minimalism documentary, there was a moment that I just thought was so profound. And the lady, she was a sociologist, she said, what do we do when we want to buy a house? We go to the bank and we ask them the question, how much can I borrow?
Yeah.
And that becomes the amount of the house that we look for. She goes, just because you can borrow that much doesn't mean that's what you should buy your house for. Just because your borrowing capacity is $1 million,
Yep.
maybe look for a house that's 700,000. Like, don't max it out. Create some margin. Now, she's not coming from a Christian perspective, but again, you would say, and I would say, that margin can be used for something bigger than yourself.
Yep.
To come back to Keller, I heard him say at another point, I think it was in a sermon, not on a tweet, he's talking about tithing
Yep.
in the law. And it's a pretty ballsy statement that he makes. He says, in light of the gospel, given that Jesus has given you everything, tithing should probably be the bare minimum. If anything, the new covenant should lead to more financial generosity than the old, where one was mandated a certain amount. Now we've got the freedom of our hearts. We've received everything in Christ. His argument is giving should have gone up
Yeah.
after Jesus, but if anything, it's gone down.
So the nice thing about living in a digital world is that you can actually see all your expenses and outgoings.
Yep.
And I think that the outworking of that is really simple because your average individual at church, I think, gives about $20 a week.
Okay.
So that's roughly your phone. That's your phone contract a month. That's where we sit on average. Someone's listening to this and goes, I'm well above average. Bless your heart. Thank you so much. I wish you were in my church. That, I think, allows us to see where God sits amongst our possessions. Correct me if I'm wrong on this.
Yeah,
right?
no, and I think hearing you say that, it does feel like a trust thing as I'm processing this.
Right,
you
it's
know.
trust.
It is. It's if I give more, that means I have less. That means I have less security.
Yep.
It's a security thing. Yes, there's a I want this. I want to buy this thing. That's
Yep.
one component, but it's also the rainy day component of I need a bit more of a nest egg. If
Yep.
I give this, my life just starts to teeter a little bit too much. And as a person of faith, I think that mindset needs to be challenged. Again, as I'm saying this, I feel like a massive hypocrite. Let me just say, like, I'm wrestling with this because I'm I'm definitely not there myself.
Well, and generational wealth to your children isn't a demonstrator of good parenting. So oftentimes we want to say to ourselves, I need to amass and accumulate some wealth so I can leave something for my
Well,
children.
and can I say, I don't know where you're about to go here, but that is a massive factor in my life. Seriously,
Yeah.
Italian family, dad came from nothing and got wealth. I feel like, unlike you,
Yeah.
I don't want to break the chain. I want to continue the chain.
Yep.
That is a big thing that hangs over my head and my heart, seriously.
Okay, so then let's say this. Globally, if creation of generational wealth for your children was an indicator of good parenting, then about 95% of the population of the earth
Sure.
would not be particularly good parents.
Yeah.
And so we can't use that as the litmus test for whether or not we're being a good parent. You could leave your children with nothing
Yep.
and be an extraordinary parent.
If you're not leaving them with money, what can you be leaving with them instead?
Oh, well, character development. You could strong resilience.
Yeah.
Obviously, we're Christians, so a firm and deep understanding of the love of the Lord. But my goal as a parent is to raise a child who can be independent of me but fully dependent on Christ. You know, and it feels like a catch cry, but you hear people like Shaquille O'Neal, who has amassed significant wealth, saying, "I'm not going to leave any of this to my kids."
Yep.
Warren Buffett
Yep.
has said the same thing.
Yep.
I'm not leaving them anything. And we go, "Oh, what a jerk!" It's like, mate, that might be the best gift that he could possibly leave his children.
Yep.
Because amassing wealth for your children is not an indicator of good parenting.
Yeah. Yeah. There, excuse me. There is a very, I think, clear Bible verse that we have to do with greed. It comes from 1 Timothy 6.
Yep.
And what's good about it is it is about the heart, and it talks a lot about not just money but contentment.
Yep.
So Paul likens, or he puts these paradigms together. So he says in 1 Timothy 6, but godliness with contentment is great gain. Isn't that interesting? He uses the word gain.
Yeah.
That's spiritual gain. Godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. Those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap, and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. What do you think about that?
Oh, this is the most confronting podcast I've had to do, because you're asking me right now to grapple with a sin that I just want to
Shy away from.
Mate, I'm squirming in my chair because I realise that you're speaking to my heart, and there's stuff that needs to change, and that means sacrifice.
Yeah.
And I just probably
Don't want to do it.
same as you. You know, I got concern for my kids, and
Yeah.
I've got concern for providing for them. And what I have to keep on coming back to is, if I look at a global wealth index, I sit in the top 10% of richest people on earth.
Yeah.
You know, and if you were
And
to,
for me, with the property, I've probably moved from 10 to 2.
yeah,
So, you know.
and you could pull out all the billionaires, which
Yeah.
are skewing the graph.
Yeah.
So you pull out the top 5 wealthiest people on earth,
Yeah.
and reshape the paradigm a bit more, and you're probably up around 6%, depending on where you live, wealthiest humans on earth.
Yep.
And so you have to be okay with the fact that you don't have the latest, and you don't have the greatest, and you don't have the name brands. But what you're doing is taking that wealth and investing it into kids in developing countries, or church leaders in developing countries, so that they can actually survive, right? So it's this idea of stepping outside of the realm of want and leveraging those margins within your life to the most significant capacities, and investing those into the realms of need.
It's almost like, as you say that, it's like God is asking us to work under him to bring us, and we will never get there, but bring us closer to shalom.
Yeah.
The shalom that we lost outside of the garden, this perfect distribution of natural resources has now become so skewed in the fall, and wealth inequality and social inequality. And again, this side of the new creation, we won't reach it, but we can bring, another line of the Lord's Prayer, your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven.
Yeah.
Bring a little bit of that down, help redistribute the wealth, and help bless some people along the way. What's the flip side, to be honest, of the 1 Timothy passage? And I was once pastoring someone of significant wealth, and they were wrestling with the famous camel through the eye of the needle passage. And Jesus' teaching is obvious. He's saying a camel can't pass through the eye of the needle.
Yeah.
And he was really wrestling with that, because in isolation, and what had been preached to him was, I'm stuffed. I'm really rich. I'm not getting into heaven. But the very next line that Jesus says is, but what is impossible with man is possible with God. And so I say that to just, in the midst of the challenge of this and the provocation of this, which we must do, we also need to be careful at the same time not to condemn ourselves to the point of either risking our security before God, we need to take those warnings really seriously, really seriously. And if I read that verse right about the camel through the eye of the needle, the only reason the rich will inherit the kingdom of earth is because God has made it possible.
Yeah.
So be profoundly thankful for that. Rest in your security with that. And at the same time, don't rest on those laurels and go, sweet, I'm good. You know, I'm going to get through the eye of the needle. Go, wow, this is a really fine line that I'm walking.
Yeah.
And how can I err towards generosity more and more?
Yeah, and I think if you use that second part as an excuse not to change anything about yourself, then you've missed the whole point.
That's really rejecting the gospel of grace.
Yeah. I have friends who live in the area who kind of are Mennonites at heart, even though there's not a Mennonite church for them to attend. And so, you know, they eat simple, the house is simple, there's not a whole bunch of possessions. And there's something really beautiful about when you go over and visit them, is that you walk into this, what is a fairly quaint 3-bedroom home, but there's a huge amount of space because there's not a whole bunch of possessions in them, you know, and they spend a lot of time outside. They've got a really simple car, and life is simple. And what often happens in life is we start to be ruled by the possessions we accumulate. You've got a big lawn. Guess what you have to do? You have to mow that lawn. You've got multiple cars. Guess what you've got to do? You've got to insure, wash, care for, service all those automobiles. And that is part of the fear of what we're seeing. And we call this consumerism, but it's greed.
John Mark Comer talks about it in the context of time. He says in his book, you know, we often say, I wish I had another 8 hours in the day.
Yeah.
Said, okay, play that thought experiment. If you did have another 8 hours in the day, what would you do? You'd pick up more hobbies, you'd work a few more hours, and you'd be saying, I wish I had another 8 more hours in the day. And it's the same with money. I mean, that's the whole point of greed, right? It's got to start with the heart, the posture, the margin. It's an internal reality. It's not to do with your bank balance. It's easy for me to say that in my position, if I'm in poverty, of course it is. There's a security issue there. I want to be sympathetic, very sympathetic to that. But for most of us in the West, it's a heart issue, not a financial issue.
Yeah, and along John Mark Comer's point, you want to really test that. Take a day off and just spend it with Jesus.
Well, another episode here on Sabbath, but I've often thought about time, or I've often thought about Sabbath as the tithing of your time.
Yeah.
It's the, can the world keep spinning? Can I keep functioning? Will I still be alive if I proverbially sacrifice some of these resources to the Lord? Yeah, you will be. And that's the point. You will see that God has always had you. He's always provided for you, and it will be okay. And that's the beauty of giving and coming through the other end.
I stood up on Sunday and I said to the church recently, I said, Fridays are my Sabbath day. And you know, this is why we don't do podcasts on a Friday. We call them on a Tuesday. Friday's my Sabbath day. That's me and Jesus time. And I don't compromise that for anyone, which is why I don't answer my phone. I don't respond to you. The only lady I'll talk to on that day is my wife. And I won't answer that phone unless you're dead. You know, and there was this like gasp. But my point was I want to be protective of those moments that I can have with Jesus. And if I'm not protective and if I don't have some really strong kind of parameters for that in my life, then it just gets compromised.
Yeah, and it's not just about resting your body, it's resting your soul. And giving is the same thing. It's saying this whole thing does not rest on my shoulders as a pastor in a church, but also as a Christian in the world. The world will keep spinning with or without me. My life will keep going with or without that possession. So test it. Take that thing away and see that it kept going and it was fine. And with that, you recognize that it's God on the throne, not yourself.
I like that. Can I make one recommendation too on top of that?
Please.
If you are a significant giver, one of the questions I would ask...
Give to the Duncan Fund.
No, that's not it. Is that when you give, do you put parameters on what that giving is for, how it's going to be used? Like if oftentimes you find within church, someone says a significant benefactor, I'm going to give this to the church, but you have to use it for this. It's going to be invested in this. I want you to put this. And they put all these parameters on it. I want to suggest that when you're being generous and you're giving to the Lord, that you should be giving in such a way that you are just releasing that with no strings attached, because part of that narrative is that if you have strings attached to it, you still care about it in some way, shape or form. But if the leadership makes a terrible decision and they acknowledge they make a terrible decision and it goes and you're like, this is why I'm never giving again, you've missed the point on generosity. And that's really hard because it's a significant chunk of change.
Yep.
But if you believe that the Lord is the Lord of a cattle on 1,000 hills from Malachi, then you need to trust that God is even at work in those broken, terrible decisions.
Fascinating.
Right?
I'm trying to work out if I agree with it. I'm going to have to sit on that.
Because it's a stewardship conversation.
Sure, that's the counter argument is I've made money. I know how to make money. I will teach you how to make money by putting parameters around it.
Okay.
Yep, that's the counter argument. But I also love your counter argument that if you lose it, you'll still see that God had a plan for it all along.
Yeah. So to your point, I think stewardship is important. If someone clearly doesn't have any sense of what they're doing with it, but I'm saying that if you have seen the church make wise decisions up to that point, sow into it.
Yep.
Now, if they make a bad decision, you've lost it. Okay, that sucks.
Yep.
But it's not your prerogative to put emphasis on what it should be used for with all these parameters.
Yep.
It's not really giving. It's like a Christian benevolent investment fund.
It's like regifting control.
Yeah. Like, imagine if I gave you a present, like I don't know, like I give you a pair of Panda Dunt lows, but I say to you, listen, you can only wear them on dry days.
Yeah.
And you can't crease the toe, so I need you to put toe protectors in there.
And I'd be like, Duncan, you're already speaking my language.
Yeah.
No, I know what you're saying. You can't put conditions on a gift. It's not really a gift at that point.
Yeah. Oh, and by the way, don't sweat in them.
No, I can't guarantee that one.
Yeah, right. Like you'd be like, well,
Just take them back.
take it back.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's kind of, I guess, what I'm. Yeah, I'm with you. Good stewardship is
Sure.
wise.
I feel like part of the challenge of this whole conversation is where do we start? It's very abstract. It's very like, what is greed? How do I not be greedy? Maybe let's just model as we start to zone out. Like, what's one thing you're going to do off the back of this? One very practical thing that's going to change for you after this conversation.
I'm going to stop looking at advertisements on social media. I've been a proponent that the algorithm knows me so well, it gives me exactly what I want.
Yeah.
But that's the problem, is it gives me exactly what I want, is that I just need to be more aware that I have enough. And so I think I'm going to start by asking the question, do I already have enough? And the answer is yes. That's where I think it's got to start for me. What about you?
Yeah, I'm trying to... I think probably some sort of lump sum donation. I think something that just hurts a bit.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, not just like a trickle, but and I don't have a number yet. I'll work it out. But something that when I looked at it on paper was like, oh man,
That's going to hurt.
Please no.
That's going to put us in a hole for a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's probably what I'll do.
Can I? There's I forget which book it is. It talks about like cycles of wealth. So you go poor, rich, poor, rich, poor.
What does it? I'm not familiar with this concept.
Okay, so you start off poor. You've got no assets, no money, right? And then you get your first job, and when you get your first job, probably you're still living under your household, and so it's
all disposable.
It's all disposable.
Yeah.
You get married. Now you've got double income, no kids.
Yep.
And then you have children, and you realise they cost $750,000.
It's a double whammy because one of you has to stop working, and you have a new expense. It's brutal.
Boom,
brutal.
Right? Probably, and also a mortgage.
Yep.
And then after that, they all move out, and you're now really successful at your job.
Yep.
So you're double income again, no kids.
Yeah.
And you've paid off everything.
Yep.
So you're rich again. And then you downsize, you retire, you quit work, you retire. Now you're poor. Mm-hmm. And so you go poor, rich, poor, rich, poor.
Interesting.
Okay.
And what's the conclusion of that?
Well, I think the problem is that if we don't establish good giving habits when we're poor,
Yep.
and you and me right now are poor,
Yep.
ish. If we don't establish them when it's hard,
Yep.
and giving doesn't become costly for us, then we will never establish good giving habits when we're rich.
Yep.
And so when our kids eventually move out and we have disposable income again, if we haven't established it now. So what I'm saying to whoever's listening, to you, to me, is that if we don't learn to give sacrificially when it hurts,
Yes.
and when we're poor, and when we're looking at it and going, this is going to cost us,
Yep.
we will miss the opportunities to see the beauty in dependence on God
Yep.
because we've got nothing.
Yep.
And then God shows up and does something remarkable because we're just dependent on ourselves.
Yep. And just to add a theological lens to that, and this is not new thinking, to think of what Christ gave up
Yeah.
to become one of us, and a really average one of us on paper,
Yep.
socioeconomically.
Yep.
I'm not speaking,
Yep.
Philippians 2, imitating Christ's humility. Did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but it's Christ gave it all for us. That can't be a guilt trip, and it can't be, the message of that is not be Jesus and you'll become like Jesus. It's no, rest in the fact that he's bridged that gap, but also recognize his priorities, his humility, recognize the benefit that you have garnered from that decision that God made, and pay that forward to the best of your ability.
It's good. It's good. All right. Well, we'll wrap it up there. Do want to remind everyone, Discord channel is up. You can find the link for that on all our social media. The other thing I want to say is questions, comments, feedback. That's
Yep.
the best place probably now to do it is through the Discord channel. You can leave messages on Facebook and Insta as well. We see that. And if you're on Spotify too, you can leave a message on Spotify.
Yes.
We want to make sure that we're answering the awkward question, the difficult question, right?
Yep, absolutely. I think we've done one today, but there's many, many more out there.
I don't want to do another one
There's
like
a
this.
herd of elephants.
All right, team. We'll see you again next week with another dead elephant.
Bye.